And
Okay.
yeah, I'm going to turn it over to Brittany. She's going to go over some housekeeping items and then we'll get started.
Yeah, well, just hi and welcome to our event this evening. Most of you probably know me. I'm Brittany Cooper and I'm Executive Director of Nebraskans for Peace. Tonight, our event will be moderated by our board president, Maggie Ballard. Just a few things about the event tonight. We are recording it. You probably just saw that message and it'll be available on our YouTube following the event, maybe in the next day or two. So we would ask you keep your mics muted. It's up to you if you want your camera on or off for the duration of the event. And we will do a Q&A with panelists. So please put your questions in the chat. We'll try to get to them all. If we don't, I'll put my email in the chat. You can always email them to me and I can get back with Maggie, Jill, or Alex. So I'll just tell you a little bit about Maggie. She was born in Scottsbluff and raised in Lincoln. She's been living in Omaha since 2005. She received her bachelor's degree in criminal justice and returned to graduate school for public administration, both at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. Maggie has served on our Nebraskans for Peace board since 2016 and has been board president since January 2023. As the legislative liaison at a large nonprofit, Maggie tracks bills, helps write testimony, meets with legislators, and works with other nonprofits to make our community safer, healthier, and happier. And Maggie actually has recently written an article on the death penalty for our next issue of the Nebraska Report. It's called A Presidential Perspective on Capital Punishment. You guys will see that hitting your mailboxes in the next week or two. So welcome, Maggie, and she will give an intro for our panelists.
Me. So like Brittany said, my name is Maggie. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I have the pleasure of introducing so far two of our three panelists. So we have Spike Eichholz, which of course you all probably saw on the flyer and the emails. And with the nature of what Spike does, because the legislative session, the floor debate is going into the evenings, he's not able to be here. I told him if anything changes, which they often do quickly in the legislature, if he can jump on, we will definitely ask him some questions and give some input. But we still are very fortunate to have Alex and Jill joining us this evening. So I will go ahead and tell you a little bit about Spike in case he does join, and then talk about our other wonderful panelists as well. So Spike Eichel is a lobbyist and attorney. His lobbying clients include the ACLU of Nebraska, Nebraskans for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, one of our co-sponsors, the Nebraska Criminal Defense Attorneys Association, and more. His law practice focuses mostly in criminal defense. Spike has been involved in a number of lawsuits related to the death penalty, including a challenge to the repeal of the death penalty in Nebraska during 2016, which was a challenge to the administrative protocol of the lethal injection process in 2019, and a public records case relating to the source of the drugs used in lethal injections in Nebraska back in 2020. So we'll be grateful if Spike can join us. But we also have Jill Franke. She served as the executive director at Nebraskans for Alternatives to the Death Penalty from 2008 to 2011, and later worked for Equal Justice USA. Jill received an MPP from the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy in 2013. Jill currently lives just outside of Lincoln and works as a TIT consultant. And then lastly, we have Alex Houchin. He has built a career working within the criminal justice system to advance pro-social alternatives to incarceration. Alex holds a bachelor's degree as well as a teaching certificate in English, and often lends his time and talent toward efforts to preserve and advance solidarity and human dignity through public policy, including his work since 2020 as a sole staff member of Nebraskans for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. In his spare time, Alex enjoys making music, bird watching, and tending to way too many houseplants. So Jill and Alex, I hope you feel welcome. I hope you know how excited we are to have this event. I want to start by just giving just that little background that, Nebraskans for Peace, we have been in opposition to the death penalty, at least since before I was on the board, I'm assuming always. And so we thought that with there being a couple couple bills that got brought up this legislative session having to do with the death penalty, that it would be important for us to have a conversation about it and to get into some discussion. So you each got the list of questions ahead of time, and everyone needs to give a round of applause afterwards for our panelists for reading through the book of questions that I gave them, because there's a lot. So I'm hoping we can be concise in our answers to move through some of them, or as many of them as possible. But I'm just looking forward to having this discussion with you. So the first question, for either one of you, I don't know if you want me to pass back and forth, but I would just like one of you to explain how the death penalty works in Nebraska. So the trial, the decision that the jury and the judge make at the trial, there's like this 3-judge panel. Of course, the governor has some say. So if you could just break that down for us.
We can arm wrestle, Alex.
Oh, I don't know if that's a good idea. I think I'll just get started, and Jill, you can jump in if I mess anything up. I think you did this,
Sounds great.
Longer than I did, not just longer ago. But first and foremost, the charge has to be first-degree murder, and charge is a Class 1 felony. In Nebraska, we have Class 1 and Class 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D, and the only class of felony eligible for the death penalty is just a plain old Class 1. In order to file a first-degree murder charge, whether it's 1 or 1A, the state has a responsibility to prove that there was premeditation. You know, we often hear the phrase premeditated murder. That's the difference between like a first-degree homicide and like a second-degree homicide in the commission of some other crime that was, you know, that happened, but there was no planning involved. When prosecutors give notice that they will seek to prove aggravating factors, that's when they determine whether it's filed as a felony 1 or a felony 1A. And the difference here is that if a jury finds a defendant guilty of felony 1 first-degree murder, the sentencing phase involves a 3-judge panel tasked with determining if there are enough mitigating circumstances to sort of outweigh the aggravating circumstances. And it's important to note that they have to be unanimous in their conclusion, otherwise it's automatically a life sentence. Most recently, this happened with Bailey Boswell, the co-defendant of Aubrey Trail in that date app killing a few years ago. She got all the way to the 3-judge panel, and one of them said, no, I can't do it. One of them said, no, I vote for life. So 2-to-1 split means no death sentence. And for anyone interested in looking up what all these different circumstances are, it's under Nebraska Revised Statute 29-2523. The aggravating circumstances include like offender was previously convicted of another murder or crime involving violence. Murder was committed in an effort to conceal the commission of a crime. Murder was committed for hire or for monetary gain. Or the murder was especially heinous, atrocious, cruel, or all that stuff, which is honestly kind of subjective. And mitigating circumstances include stuff like the offender has no significant history of prior criminal activity. They were acting under the unusual pressures or influences or under the domination of another person, you know. So it's really a balancing act, and maybe it's a little bit on the nose to call up the image of the scales of justice here, but it's quite literally that. Like, do the mitigating circumstances outweigh the aggravating circumstances? And you know, that's sort of how they reach their conclusion. And as far as the governor goes, at any point the governor can step in and commute a death sentence. The Board of Pardons, which the governor is a member, can do that as well. But as I understand it, and Jill, you might know better than me, it's not until the Nebraska Secretary of State requests the death warrant. Does it start in that office?
Ooh, I
or
don't know for sure, but that seems probably correct. Yes. I know that the Secretary of State sits on in the clemency space too, right? So there's a 3-member board there. So, you know, if a sentence is going to be commuted or if clemency will be granted, the governor, the attorney general, and the Secretary of State are involved in that. It might come from the attorney general's office. To be honest, Alex, I am not sure.
well, it's certainly one of the two. I think,
Yeah.
and they're almost always on the same side.
Helpful. Thank you. That gives us a good kind of introduction or overview. So the next thing to kind of follow up with that, could either of you give us kind of an overview of the history of the death penalty in Nebraska? So, for example, my understanding, because I wasn't alive then, but back in like the 1970s, it was found federally unconstitutional. And then it got brought back. So, like, how did that happen? And how many people were executed since the 1970s?
Yeah, I'll take a run at it,
Um,
Alex, if you want, and
Yeah,
you
go for
can,
it.
yeah, you can fill me in. So, yeah, 72 would have been the Furman versus Georgia case that essentially created a de facto moratorium nationally when the death penalty was ruled unconstitutional. Then the following year in 73, Gregg versus Georgia decision sort of laid the framework down for what it took to have a constitutional death penalty in a state. And there's really sort of 2 objectives you have to meet. You sort of have to set out objective criteria that are, I think, a lot, Alex, of what you're talking about, right? What are the aggravating circumstances that we can name and judge against? And then you also have to have mitigating circumstances that are considered. So essentially that balancing scales that Alex ran through is what it takes to have a constitutional death penalty. And Nebraska did reinstate the death penalty in 73 after that guidance was issued from the Supreme Court. So
yeah. So before that, there didn't have to be a second or a close look at both the extenuating and mitigating circumstances, and it could be for maybe more than just first-degree murder. That's what I understand before 1970.
I think there was just less clarity and less consistency across the states. So I think you had some states that did have systems that were doing that and some states that had systems that weren't doing that. So in that gap between 72 and 73, nobody could do it. And then in 73, the Supreme Court sort of said, hey, these states have death penalty systems that pass muster according to us, and these don't. So yeah, I think it was really bringing, yes, states would have had varying ways of approaching it, and this just tried to give some guidelines to what, made it constitutional.
That's helpful because I know there are some criminal justice students majoring in criminal justice attending this evening. And so for those of you that are listening, just know that you just received a piece of information that I never learned during my 4 years at one of the best criminal justice programs in the country. So hang on to that piece of information. And then if either of you can answer the last part of that question about how many people are we talking about in Nebraska since the 1970s have been executed?
Well, since the modern death penalty era began in the U.S., we have had exactly 1,584 executions, and outside of our state, there have been 1,580 executions. We've killed 4 people in the last 47 years. With our death penalty, and
We've killed. Sorry, how many people did you say?
Just 4.
4. Okay.
The last one was in 2018. The one before that was 2003, and then you got to go back into the 90s for the other 2. And I would point out that when the U.S. Supreme Court sort of approved this new set of guidelines and safeguards to make sure that it was being applied constitutionally, some states just decided, nah, we're good. We don't need it. Iowa is an example. Iowa never brought the death penalty back. They were just like, no, we're good. Kansas brought it back, but they literally never used it, not one single time. And you know, a lot of states have abolished it since, including a number in just the last few years. But yeah, 1,584 executions since the death penalty came back in its new and improved constitutionally acceptable form, and only 4 of those have been here.
Good to know. Thank you, Alex. Next question, also happening in Nebraska. Can you explain what led to the electric chair finally being outlawed in 2008?
Yeah, the Nebraska Supreme Court said you can't do that anymore. So that was a Supreme Court driven change. So again, sort of creating that de facto moratorium because there was no way to carry out an execution. So, you know, I think it's interesting to note as well that from in the modern death penalty era, Nebraska has multiple times in the legislative process come very close to, and in fact actually voted to end the death penalty here. We all know about the big one, right? And we'll talk about that later. But the legislature did it in '79, and that was vetoed by Governor Throne. I'm not sure how to say that. And then in '99, we passed a moratorium to study the fairness of the application of the death penalty in Nebraska. So I think it's worth noting that it's been done here not once, but multiple times through the legislative process to say that, you know, we don't want to do this anymore. And it, you know, been varying degrees of adopted, but I think that's important to remember that it can be done. In fact, has been done here multiple times.
Right. So, how about, you know, just in recent years, you kind of touched on that there's been, you said the big one. So we talk about, you know, the legislature, what year did they outlaw it most recently? And then when did that get overturned and who did that?
Well,
yeah, go for it, Alex.
I would imagine most of the people on the call probably know the who, but let's talk about the what first. In 2015, after more than 3 decades of effort, a multi-partisan coalition in the legislature, and I say multi-partisan because there were Republicans, Democrats, 1 independent, and 1 libertarian, who sort of banded together and said, no, we don't need to do this anymore. They passed LB 268 into law. Governor Ricketts issued a veto of it, and with no margin of error, they successfully overrode the veto and abolished the death penalty in Nebraska and commuted all extant death sentences to life sentences. And for about 1.5 years, we did not have the death penalty. And this was less than a decade ago. Like, that's how recent this was. And almost immediately after the veto override, the group Nebraskans for the death penalty was formed, began a ballot referendum process to ask voters to repeal LB 268. This was successful thanks in large part to significant financial support from both then Governor Ricketts and his father, Joe. I believe together they spent, I think, $300,000 on doing this. And then in November 2016, 92 out of 93 counties, what's up, Lancaster, voted to repeal LB 268, which reinstated capital punishment and restored all the death sentences that LB 268 had commuted. Some footnotes here. A lot of people thought the ballot language was confusing. A lot of us happen to believe that was intentional because it didn't really ask, shall the death penalty be restored, but rather it asked, shall LB 268 be repealed? And I dug up the language that was on the ballot, and it said, The purpose of Legislative Bill 268, passed by the first session of the 104th Nebraska Legislature in 2015, is to eliminate the death penalty and change the maximum penalty for the crime of murder in the first degree to life imprisonment. Shall LB 268 be repealed? And then it explains the vote to retain LB 268 and the vote to repeal LB 268. So because we often use the word repeal, that was sort of, arguably an intentional effort to muddy the question just a little bit. And there was a lot of disputes over this. And there was a separate lawsuit that tried to get the ballot initiative thrown out on the grounds that such heavy financial support from the chief executive officer of the state violated the separation of powers principle, and that the executive branch was meddling and undermining authorities vested in the legislative branch. But that suit was also dismissed. Didn't get anywhere there. And finally, there was a lawsuit to unrestore those death sentences that LB 268 commuted, and that also failed. It was one blow after another, quite frankly, and it was hard. And
Thank you. That's a good overview as well.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna jump a couple of the questions that I gave you both beforehand, because you've already answered some of them about, how many people have we executed in the last 50 years, or what makes someone eligible to be sentenced to death. Alex covered that. But what we do still want to know is, how many people are we talking about here? How many people currently sit on death row in Nebraska? I should specify.
We have 11. Every time we get up to 12, something happens. I think a couple years ago, one of the death row inmates passed away from an undisclosed long-term illness. I think I heard it was some form of brain cancer. And then most recently, one died by suicide. And so we seem to be stuck at 11, for better or for worse.
And so I don't know the statistics. There might be a college student here that could give us the answer, but you might know it. But I'm guessing we have more than 11 or 15 or 20 people who have been convicted of first-degree murder. So I mean, why, and people who have been sentenced, like why do we have this? Why do we sentence people to this if it's rarely carried out?
I don't know that I have a good answer for that. It just, I think there's an emotional component. I think people are scared of violent acts, and they think that visiting violence upon the violent is some sort of almost like a safety blanket almost. It's there's no statistics that suggest they're right about this at all, but it's we know from basic neuroscience that even some extremely hard statistics are sometimes not enough to override emotionally charged beliefs.
Very true. Good point.
And I think also you get variance in counties on whether or not they want to pursue, right, death penalty prosecutions, because they're expensive and they're hard. And so some folks, you could imagine that you could experience, or you could see the same sort of circumstances of a homicide in two different counties, and there would be discretion used in one county over the other, whether or not to pursue that. So I think you also get some randomness, right, a little bit out of where the crime happens, even within the state of Nebraska, and then what a county might choose to pursue, right? I think we've seen some counties historically not be able to finance the actual cost of doing death penalty prosecutions, because when Alex talks about all of those factors that go into whether or not you can receive the death penalty, that means it takes a lot more effort to try those cases, right, and to go through all the processes to prove those things. And I think that's where a lot of the cost comes into play. And I think in some counties they've learned they're almost not able to do it.
Yeah,
So
I
you
think this would
kind of
be.
touched on. Go ahead, Alex.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to point out this is a great opportunity to bring up the Beatrice 6. These are people who were wrongly accused of being involved in a murder plot, and investigators kept threatening them with the death penalty, and they had some confessions coerced. There's a fascinating miniseries on HBO about this exact case, and they were determined to be innocent. And the settlements that county had to pay out ruined the county for years. Like, the legislature had to pass special appropriations just to keep that county afloat, because they went too hard after these innocent people. And that's an extremely expensive lesson that I bet a lot of other counties learned from.
That is a great example. And so you just made a valuable point about what the cost can be if someone is wrongfully convicted, imprisoned, all of that stuff. But I wanted to come back to something you mentioned, Jill, about it being expensive, because I've heard some kind of socially conservative people that are also fiscally conservative, and they say really the only reason for them that they impose having the death penalty is because it is so expensive, and that is a waste of the taxpayer dollars. So can you explain what about it costs the most? What about it is so expensive?
I think a lot of it is, I think a lot of it is that front end cost. I think the burden of, it's not that the burden of proof is higher, right? But sort of the burden you must meet to be able to pass muster to receive a death sentence is higher. And so you're going to have more experts that you're calling in as witnesses, right? You're going to spend more time in sort of those pretrial processes and pretrial discovery. And so you're going to have a lot more folks on the prosecution side involved in that. It's going to take longer. Everything that takes longer costs more money. So there's really the upfront costs that come into prosecuting a case like that and going through what needs to be gone through in order to have a constitutionally acceptable death penalty conviction, right? And so I think that by doing the right thing to make it pass constitutional muster, you add cost to the thing. There's also then the appeals process, which is also necessary and required. And it just continues to add to the cost of being able to do this in a way that is acceptable to the courts. So I think really a lot of it is in having to go through all that process. And I think you're not going to have a plea bargain that leads to a death penalty case. So you have to go through every single step of the process. And at the end of the day, that gets very expensive very quickly.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And I would point out that that is just what leads up to a death sentence. Once you've received a death sentence, then you have to have your constitutionally mandated appeals process, which again was part of the conditions that the Supreme Court put on states that wanted to bring it back. A lot of people complain, oh, it takes too long, we should just shoot them at the courthouse. Well, no, we can't do that, because conditions of allowing this in the first place require this lengthy process. And before we jump to the next question, I do have a pretty astonishing factoid here that probably blow a few minds. in 2016, when we were doing the run up to the ballot initiative vote, we had an economics professor up at Creighton University ran all the numbers and compared how much more do these however many cases cost versus if they had not pursued the death penalty. And that study gave a figure of $14.6 million per year just to have it on the books and to, for all the times that it's been pursued. And when you start doing the math on this, it gets to be pretty staggering, because that's in 2015 dollars. Just today, I plugged that number into an inflation calculator. In 2024 dollars, that's actually more like $19 million, a little over $19 million. And if you take that $19 million and extrapolate that all the way back to 1976, that's almost $900 million to kill 4 guys.
Wow. That is mind blowing. I'm so glad you share that, because that puts things in perspective big time, especially when we're looking at some of the priorities that our state is always setting at the legislature, which actually leads me into the next question. So I mentioned this at the beginning, but Jill, would you mind describing the 2 bills that were introduced this session? And if you would describe one, I'll ask Alex if you describe the other. And maybe you can even share why you oppose them.
Sure. Yeah, so we can talk about LB 970 first, which is titled "To Provide for Carrying Out the Death Penalty by Nitrogen Hypoxia." I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means, and I'm going to also encourage folks to maybe reconsider some language when you talk about that to other people. So essentially, this is a way to, it would be another means of carrying out the death penalty. Obviously, we have struggled, as have many other states, to be able to procure drugs to do lethal injection. I think we also see, as the medical community has refused to participate in carrying out executions, that there have been a lot of problems with lethal injection being successful. There was a gentleman in Alabama who they could not complete the lethal injection. So he survived his execution, to then recently have been put to death with this new method that folks are trying out in front of our eyes. So the idea here is that folks are essentially suffocated by pure nitrogen gas as a way of carrying out the execution. So what I want you to think about is, when you hear nitrogen hypoxia, that sounds like something that we wouldn't understand. So I think that might be on purpose. So might be worth thinking about that and maybe phrasing it differently, to really think about suffocation by nitrogen gas is what they're proposing. So I think there's been a long history of trying to make these things sound very sanitary, right? Because I think if we're able to abstract what's happening through medical terms and through things like this, it feels as though it's not as really what it is, right? Which is, killing someone using some methodology that we'd like to call with these nice names. So I think the reason that you hear some people saying we need to do this is, if you're going to have the death penalty on the books, you need to have a way to carry it out. The problem is, we haven't been successful in being able to carry out lethal injection for all the reasons I just mentioned. There's going to be reasons that this one is going to be complicated as well. Nitrogen gas can kill you. That's why they're trying to use it here. And so how is this going to be stored? How's it going to, be brought into the facility? How's that going to be managed? I think there's a lot of things that folks would need to figure out to be able to do this as well. So I don't think it's as straightforward of an answer as folks would like to say that it is. So right now, Alabama, Mississippi, Oklahoma, and Louisiana all have this procedure available to them, and Alabama is the only state that has carried out an execution using this method, at least as far as I know. So that's 970, and I think reasons to oppose this for me are that we don't experiment on people with things like execution methods. And I don't think that there's really room in government to be experimenting when it comes to something like this. So.
Thanks, Jill. I would just, I can't speak for Spike, obviously, because he's not here and I couldn't do him justice. But one of the things that he brought up when he testified that day was the fact that, you said you have to have something on the books, right? Well, as of right now, it's lethal injection. And he mentioned that everyone who's been sentenced to death since we use the method of lethal injection, it's on the paper that they are to be executed by that method. And so then what are you going to do? So that was another issue he brought up when he testified. But Alex, if you would go ahead and talk about Senator McKinney's bill.
I will, just one brief moment.
Oh, go ahead.
This is a really fun quote that I think should be like broadcast out there, but the American Veterinary Medical Association declared that nitrogen gas is inappropriate for euthanizing animals because, quote, current evidence indicates this method is unacceptable because animals may experience distressing side effects before loss of consciousness. So professional veterinarians say we shouldn't even do this to animals. Why are prison systems doing this to people? It's pretty gross. Anyway, as for the other bill introduced by Senator McKinney, LB 980, I think that's what you're referring to. It was also in the hearing that day. Yeah. That bill is actually sort of a reworked version of a bill that former Senator Patty Pansing Brooks introduced and shepherded all the way through the process in 2020. Passed all 3 rounds of debate, landed on the governor's desk, and the governor vetoed it in a way that, in such a way that an override was not possible. Like they had already adjourned for the year, and it was just a done deal. But that bill, LB 980, would provide that at least 2 members of the legislature would be allowed to attend an execution, because his argument was that, we make the laws here, and if we honestly, it's a bit of a Game of Thrones argument in my mind, because if we're going to pass a law that this is, what we should be able to do to people, we should, be there. We should witness it. We should have to have a seat in front of it, all that stuff, look it in the face, basically. And the other, possibly even more important component to LB 980 was to provide that at no point shall the process be concealed. In 2018, when the state of Nebraska executed Carrie Dean Moore via lethal injection, which was the first one in the country that used fentanyl, which is interesting because fentanyl is such a big scary word right now. And yeah, okay, our state's going to use it to do exactly what we're afraid of it doing to people. Anyway, a couple of different times during that execution process, they lowered the curtain because Carrie was visibly struggling on the gurney, and Senator Patty was in the viewing chamber trying to be that witness, and she was very upset that this is what you're doing in our name. At the very least, we should be able to watch it. We should have to, we deserve a chance to see it carried out if we're going to have this terrible policy. Unfortunately, I think LB 980 is probably going to remain stuck in committee. A lot of decent bills have died there on a 4-4 vote because you have to have a majority vote to get out, and there's only 8 people. The flip side of that is it seems like LB 970 will also suffer the same fate. So, if that's the trade-off, I'll take it.
Yeah, thank you. I'm gonna come back to the next question. Not that the audience has it, but if you're going in order, Jill or Alex, I'm gonna come back to the next question because I know, again, we have some criminal justice students that were assigned to answer what you say at this next question. So I was wondering if you could please discuss the role that gender and race play in the death penalty. Some of the inconsistencies or discrepancies there amongst women and people of color.
Well, I've got a bunch of stats queued up.
Yeah, go for it, Alex.
Okay, all right. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, which is a wonderful non-partisan nonprofit, just sort of a clearinghouse for all this data, more than 75% of murder victims that result in an execution were white, even though nationally only 50% of murder victims are white. Of the 326 persons executed for interracial murders, 21 were a white defendant with a black victim, while 305 were a black defendant with a white victim. Of the 2,333 death row inmates in the U.S. as of January 1st last year, 42% were white, 41% were black, and 14% were Latinx. However, according to census.gov, our nation, as of July 1st of last year, the population was 59% white and only 13.6% black, 19.1% Latinx. Some related studies. A 2014 study found that jurors in Washington are 3 times more likely to recommend a death sentence for a black defendant than for a white defendant, given similar circumstances. 2011 study found that in Louisiana, the odds of receiving a death sentence for killing a white victim was 97% higher than for killing a black victim. A 2005 study found that in California, those convicted of killing whites were more than 3 times as likely to receive a death sentence as those convicted of killing blacks, and more than 4 times more likely as those convicted of killing Latinx people. And overall, in 96% of states that have had any sort of review of the disparity of race in capital punishment, there was either a clear pattern of race of victim discrimination, race of defendant discrimination, or both. And to shift gears a little bit, as far as gender goes,
let me first ask you if you happen to be reading that off of a source, would you mind dropping that in the chat towards the end, maybe? Because I feel like you spelled it out so well, but it's also a lot to keep track of, right? So I know, like, when I was writing the article for the Nebraska report, so that I didn't make it so long, what I said was, but I know people want more precise statistics. I said, that people who kill whites are more likely to get the death penalty than people who kill non-whites. And then if I am non-white, I'm more likely to get the death penalty than if I am white. And then, if you have both of those factors, it's even stronger. So I just wanted to take a pause there if you would. And if you want to do that later too, that's fine. I just thought it might be helpful to come back to for people. But with that, I'll let you go on and talk about gender if you would, since I cut you off, and I apologize.
got it in there.
Perfect.
Yeah, I can do that too. And the big answer about gender is we don't actually have a lot of data. There have only been 18 women executed in America since 1976, and that's really too small of a sample size to get any sort of trends out of. I was able to find you know, I was doing my research on all these questions, and I actually learned some things too. So, you know, thank you for some of these in-depth questions. I found a 1991 journal article that argued the reason there are so few women on death row, and for the record, right now there's only 52 out of the nation's 2,331 death row inmates, which is 2.2%. The reason for this is that women only commit about 2% of homicides. Incredible. And a 2000 United Nations study found, I'll skip that. I think we really don't spend enough time talking about this disparity because I gotta tell you, if these stats suddenly flipped and we woke up tomorrow and women were committing 98% of all homicides, there would be a national conversation about it pretty quick. The fact that no one's really, you know, having a broad scale conversation about what is it about dudes that makes us commit 98% of all homicides. You know, we don't really have that conversation so much. I think that's really, really gross, quite frankly. I saw someone mention in the chat there's also the disparities between the socioeconomic backgrounds of people who commit homicides, and also there's a geographical disparity. In fact, this is kind of incredible. Just 2% of U.S. counties are responsible for 52% of all executions since 1976. Yeah, Susan, I saw your jaw literally drop. And I would also point out that 82% of all executions since 1976 have taken place in the South. And I saw a graphic just the other day that said there are rural counties in the Deep South that have a higher per capita violent crime rate than most big cities. So
that's important data too. Yeah. I think that's helpful to bring up. And so, of course, you know, the fact that it's happening in certain counties and in certain states, there's, you know, a reasonable explanation or rational explanation for that, right? It has to do with what the laws are there, you know, if it's even possible to some extent. However, it's probably safe to say when we're looking at the race of the victim and the race of the offender, that when we're looking at who is going to get executed or who is going to be sentenced to the death penalty, it sounds like you're saying that it's not so much about the extenuating circumstances or the nature of the crime, but rather some other factors that really get played out.
Yeah, there's a pretty high cross-section of death row inmates that, experience childhood trauma, have serious mental health issues, and I forgot the third one, but it probably relates to poverty of some sort. So, you know, it's the golden rule. Those who have the gold make the rules. So.
So true. So true. That's not what we were all taught. And I heard you mention, looking at the chat, and I actually scolded Jill for answering something ahead of time. I said, we'll come back to those later. So if you haven't had your question answered by the panelists yet, don't worry, we'll come back to that. Or, you know, we will look at some of those at the end if they don't get answered along the way. But the next question, which I feel like is really the million-dollar question, that's looking at the title of our event this evening, I would ask each of you, how can a pro-life state, how can we justify having the death penalty? Because I feel, you know, if I was to play devil's advocate, I would say that some people care about babies, but not murderers. Some people claim to care about murderers, but not babies. So how can we, at least on paper, maybe, you know, we're not the legislators, but how could we harmonize being pro-life? Or can we?
Jill?
I think this one is really difficult. I think it is complicated to try to compare and contrast two very deeply emotional issues for many people. And so I think it's sometimes kind of an I get it. I get why we have this desire to sort of try to call it out as a comparison, but I think it struggles to lead anywhere productive because I think that folks are really considering those two policies from very different vantage points. You know what I mean? And so to ask for consistency across there, I'm not sure how that gets us anywhere. That is really helpful. I think, you know, what we know for sure is that this when I was also doing a lot of studying, Alex, when these questions came out. So Maggie, thank you. And
good question.
They were really great, and also it was good to sort of have a reason to really dig in. But in the Gregg versus Georgia dissent from Justice Brennan in 1972, right, which is when we had that first de facto moratorium. He said, the calculated killing of a human being by the state involves, by its very nature, a denial of the executed person's humanity. An executed person has indeed lost the right to have rights. And so, you know, if we're sort of pro life and we believe that people who are alive have rights, taking away someone's life essentially takes away their ability to have any rights. And so, you know, I think that, I don't know, that spoke to me pretty deeply about what it is here that, you know, brought me into this work, and I think brings a lot of people to this work. You know, it is pro-life in a way, but I think it is complicated to try to conflate these two, not conflate them, but to use these two issues to compare to each other. I don't know that you know, it's really ever moved anybody's opinion on anything. So I don't know, I struggle with that one.
It is pretty tough. I was gonna say, Jill, I'm sure you have plenty of experience with this kind of thing, but you know, when we're out in the community, whether it's tabling at an event or just doing our Monday vigils, sometimes people in the community who just wander by will, you know, use that as a challenge, you know. So you all, you know, like it's bait, right? It's like, oh, so you don't believe in execution, so you also don't believe in abortion access or whatever the case may be. And it happens a lot, and you know, fortunately, it gives us lots of practice because we have always, sort of by necessity, been extremely disciplined about this. We don't engage with those kinds of like whataboutism debates, and you know, sometimes I'll just like stone face. I'll say, you know, we're here to talk about capital punishment in the criminal justice system. It's got nothing to do with that. Like I suppose it's good that I've had so much practice by now. But on the other hand, you know, we do a table every year at the Bishop's Pro-Life Conference in downtown Lincoln, and it's interesting because and Patrick's on the call, he can back this up. A lot of the elected officials won't even make eye contact with us. They just pass right on by. But a lot of the attendees, clergy in particular, will come up to us and say, you know, we're so glad you're here. People need to be reminded that pro-life means pro-life. And you know, if we get down into the, I guess, down into the mud and start arguing over, well, this means that this about that issue, and trying to, you know, jam these two issues together, it's really, it doesn't help either side, honestly. And I think this is a very good strategy because both issues are certainly nuanced and both issues have lots of room for spiritual, philosophical, legal, even disagreement. But I think we're kind of overlooking a pretty simple answer here, which is that, setting aside that other issue, there's nothing pro-life about killing people, period. Like, we don't need to be any more complicated than that. There's nothing pro-life about killing people. There's no mental gymnastics that can square those two things. Being professing to be a pro-life state and killing people is just incompatible. It's not even possible. And I don't want to hog the mic for too long, but there was a guy from New Hampshire who helped lead the abolition efforts there. His name was Rennie Cushing. Unfortunately, he passed a couple of years ago, but before he did, I was lucky enough to get on a Zoom call with him, and he said his father was killed by a off-duty cop when he was only 33 or 36 or something like that. And he said, the thing that people are always surprised about is that I never forgave that man. I never forgot that. It's got nothing to do with forgiveness. We're not asking anyone to forgive these people. His point was always that, in fact, I actually pulled a direct quote from an interview. I realized that if I changed my position to before the death penalty, that would only compound the crime. Not only would my father's life be taken from me, but so would my values. I didn't want to have that happen, and I think it's the same for society as it is for individuals. If we let those who kill turn us into murderers, evil triumphs, and we're all worse off. He likened it to throwing a stone into a pond, where these ripples of pain like radiate out from the original event, the original killing. And why on earth would we want to add another set of ripples? Like, it's not solving any problems. It's just vengeance. So it is
You
a very
just dove into one of my next questions that I assigned you each to look at, which I think that's great. Talking about, kind of why, what I asked them to share with the audience. I asked, why should someone be opposed to the death penalty from a spiritual point of view, from a peacemaker's point of view? That's what Nebraskans for Peace really tries to aim to be at any time, but also just from that legal or criminal justice point of view. And so, Alex, I think that quote you shared about, compounding the crime and also what it turns us into does a really good job of answering a couple of those. But Jill, do you have anything you want to add to those questions about why people should be opposed to the death penalty from a spiritual point of view or from a peacemaker's point of view?
Yeah, I think there's a very similar spirit to what the Catholic Bishops' Conference said. We oppose capital punishment, not just for what it does to those guilty of horrible crimes, but for what it does to all of us as a society. We cannot overcome crime by simply executing criminals, nor can we restore the lives of the innocent by ending the lives of those convicted of their murders. So again, I think it's very similar, Alex, to Rennie's kind of observation. And I think, hearing that coming from the Catholic Conference, right, talks about kind of the spiritual aspect of it. And I think from a sort of a criminal justice and a legal perspective, someone had asked earlier in the chat, what are the stats on what the death penalty does to the crime rate or something like that. And I think that is inherently difficult to study because we can't, in fact, know what would happen in Nebraska without the death penalty because we have it. So it's a little bit hard to do like a real double-blind, scientific study on something like that. But I think that we can listen to people who have been in law enforcement and been in criminal justice work for a long time. And we see a lot of people in police forces, police captains being very outspoken about the fact that when they see those numbers that Alex was listing off, there's a lot of ways they could imagine using that to make a community more safe. right? And so we can, I think, if we want to take our, guidance from folks who are trying to keep communities safe in theory, day in and day out, if they feel there's a better use of those resources, I think we can look towards that to believe that they don't think it's deterring, right, folks, they're experiencing this, they don't think it's a deterrent. So I mean, I think, Alex, you said sort of zero. I believe, right? I think we believe sort of that we don't see deterrent effects in the stats, but I think the stats on this one are a little bit difficult to do because we can't know the opposite of what we're doing and what would happen. But we see sort of commissioned or studies commissioned for police chiefs where folks are saying, we don't want you to spend the money this way. And even in the legislature, when the debate was happening around the death penalty, Jim David Saver, who was I think a captain in the Lincoln Police Department, said the millions of dollars we spent on the death penalty would have been much better invested in more police officers, additional resources or training for our current officers, that sort of thing. So that's kind of the piece you might think about from a legal perspective.
Yeah, that's great. And I just to give the audience kind of a map of where we're headed, I have just one more question after this, and then we can get to anything else that Jill or Alex wanted to share that I interrupted them before they got to, or anything else that didn't come up in the many questions I asked. Then we'll get to audience questions. But I'll insert just kind of a footnote here when it comes to whether or not it's a deterrent. Just what I was taught at, UNO as a criminal justice major was that it's not that we can prove that it's not a deterrent. It's that we cannot prove that it is a deterrent, if that makes sense. It's a double negative there, but that was kind of how it was talked about back then. That was just a couple of years ago. But I wanted to just ask this question. Actually, I have to give credit to Tessa Foreman, who is a very active member of our social justice committee and a board member of Nebraskans for Peace. She talked about how the Innocence Project, which if you would just kind of explain what that is, but it has proven, of course, many people's innocence that have sat on death row, and sometimes they've been sitting there for decades. And so why are some states refusing to test DNA? Why are some people not taking advantage of the Innocence Project?
Well, first, as to the number of exonerations, the Innocence Project has helped exonerate hundreds, if not thousands, of people for various crimes that they were incarcerated for. Currently, as of just last month, the number of people exonerated from death row since 1973 reached 196. So we're knocking on the door of 200 people who would have otherwise been executed. This is not, oops, we made a mistake, we'll let you out. There's no unkilling someone who you later find out was innocent. And in fact, our good friend and colleague, I don't know if she's on the call tonight, Fran Kay, testified once in the Judiciary Committee that since we cannot achieve 100% certainty that we will never, ever execute an innocent person, then by definition, having the death penalty requires us to kill an innocent person. And, you can talk about cost or spiritual reasons or any of these other avenues that different people reach to conclude that the death penalty is bad public policy. That's the only one I need. It requires innocent blood, and nothing that requires innocent blood should exist. So as for why some states refuse to do DNA testing, I don't know how to answer that, honestly. I sort of rolled that one around in my head for a while, and maybe this is perhaps borderline cynical, but I kind of think that judges and prosecutors, the actual people that make up the criminal justice system in those states might be more invested in protecting the ethos of the criminal justice system itself, rather than making it more just in practice. To put it another way, if your livelihood and your professional reputation depend on the population having trust in the system that you're a part of, the exonerations that DNA testing would likely lead to could be seen as a direct threat. So maybe it's a CYA thing, you know?
Yeah, it might be cynical, but it makes sense. You know, it's wanting to save face, but I think you did a good job of kind of explaining that part of it is because they have a lot at stake, not just for their professions, but for the law, the criminal justice system that they represent, that they work for. Jill, do you want to add anything?
I think I couldn't think of a reason that sounds like as close to a reason. I mean, I think they're going to tell you it's expensive. They're going to tell you, right, that there's a backlog, that they're can't go, fishing through every case and try to, I think there'd probably be a lot of excuses there, but I'm going to guess it's something similar to what you said, Alex, right? Where we're relying on trust here, and we don't want to put any cracks in the veneer.
If you start throwing out convictions because of new methods of doing forensic science, then what does that say about your convictions? Nothing good, probably.
Yep. I mean, I think we saw when there was a particular employee at one of the labs in Oklahoma, I believe it was, that they sort of figured out had been getting the results that prosecutors wanted out of the forensics lab. It put every single conviction that she had a role in into question, and I think stuff like that is super scary and not something that anybody who is in the business of keeping this all going wants to be dealing with.
Absolutely. We had a similar situation here in Nebraska. An administrative state patrol employee was caught stealing drugs from the evidence locker and giving them to a friend who was going out and selling them. And as a result, a bunch of criminal cases got dismissed and thrown out. And I know that specifically in my regular job. Like we had a bunch of our caseload just evaporate into thin air because this compromising of state justice proceedings had irrevocably harmed those cases. So and these were people charged with like class 3 and class 4 felonies that you could let out if something like this happened. If someone were executed based on some corrupt findings, I don't know how anyone ever recovers from that sort of an outcome. And that should keep judges and prosecutors alike awake at night, I think.
Well, before we move into some questions in the chat, and I'm hoping Brittany will kind of help filter through those because I know that a lot of them got answered along the way. But before we move into that, I just wanted to give you both an opportunity to discuss or share anything else, any last comments on this topic.
I might just echo a little bit of what I saw Megan and Stephen and others in the chat saying here, which is there are a lot of folks on this phone call who've put a lot of time and energy and I don't know if we were sweating very often, but there might have been crying, right? So the sweat, tears, all that. And, when I was saying earlier to remember how many times the state has tried to do something about this through the legislature, almost all of that came from really hard work that folks were doing. And Alex, when you talked about sort of that coalition, right? I had moved out of the state at the time that that repeal bill passed, but it was incredible to see the different kinds of folks coming from very different backgrounds for very different reasons, who showed up to make that happen. And I think, I hope folks, it's really depressing, honestly, to sit and think about the fact that we are still doing this despite all of that, but there is something really incredible about having been able to achieve that. And I hope that, there continues to be some energy like that, and that, folks are able to continue to show up and do that. And just thanks to everybody on here who has been doing this for a really long time and continues to put a lot of effort into this. So,
it feels a little bit like a reunion, right?
Like a little bit like a reunion. And thanks for letting me come is really mainly the point that I want to make.
Thanks, Jill. Alex, if you have any last comments you want to share?
Again, I sort of sat with this question and rolled it around in my head a little bit before I think I formulated some kind of an answer. But I think, when we think of kitchen table policy issues, this is probably the last one that anyone would mention, right? This doesn't affect the price of groceries. This doesn't affect real estate rates, interest rates, any of that stuff.
Kind of.
But that's sort of exactly why I think we should get rid of it. Like, this is not something that affects almost anyone's life in any material way. And I sort of just throw my
It
hands
affects
up
a lot of people.
and I say,
Kyle,
what
can
are we
I have
doing
you
here?
mute yourself? Sorry,
Oh,
Alex.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I didn't know I was unmuted. My bad.
That's okay. Yeah.
Okay.
That's okay.
But yeah, just like, what are we doing here? What's the role of any of this? And I think again, those staggering cost numbers I mentioned earlier, over $800 million on 4 executions across 47 years. I mean, how much better off would we be if those resources were redirected towards restorative justice initiatives, victim support? I didn't get time to dig up the actual figures, but I know we're like on the very bottom of the list when it comes to programs and initiatives that actually help victims of violent crime. Like, we're one of the worst. Like, at the very least, maybe if we got rid of this terrible policy, we could climb up to, I don't know, maybe the middle of the pack. Who knows? It just seems like it's such a niche kind of issue that that's all the more reason I think that we would be better off without it. I mean, Iowa's doing okay. They don't have it. They never brought it back. So, and yeah, so I think that's my closing statement is this is such a big deal to a very few number of people and almost meaningless to most people. So let's get rid of it. Let's, we don't have to count ourselves among the places around the world that, exult in executions like, Iran, China, Saudi Arabia. These are all countries that, people like to fearmonger about, but, we're killing people almost as fast as some of them. So we can do better, I think, is my.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alex. So Brittany, would you mind coming off mute and maybe sharing some of the questions that we didn't get a chance to answer yet?
Yeah. One we had pretty early on when we were mentioning that the Ricketts family basically paid to, reinstate the death penalty in Nebraska was, did they benefit in some financial way, or, why would they, why spend that amount of money, if anyone knows?
Go ahead, Alex.
This is always a really good question, and I think Josh and I have had this late night debate several different times. But something that I think maybe not a lot of people know is there was someone in Pete Ricketts' family that was murdered, and I don't know if it ever got solved. So I think on some level, it might actually be personal for him.
Interesting.
You know, again, that's me assuming the most wholesome intentions for everyone. That you know, you can debate whether or not somebody that has done those things deserves such grace, but why not? You know, it at least helps understand the man a little bit. As far as do I think he got any financial benefit, I can't imagine how he could have. Like there's no money. There's no money in this.
Mhm. I think would you agree though that there's been several kind of big moves that now Senator Ricketts made as governor that seem to serve him well politically? I mean, look at this. Listen to the sentence I just said, right? He was governor and now he's a federal senator. And so I think that he did a lot of things that got him to where maybe he might have had his eye on.
That could be. You know, you can make a case for that for sure. It is one of the most pernicious aspects of the sort of culture war that this has become is, you know, well, are you being soft on crime or are you being tough on crime? And there's this false narrative that advocating for an end to executions is somehow being soft on crime. I would argue it's being smart on crime. It's being reasonable on crime. But, you know, when you've only got like a 10-second soundbite, the rhetorical value of being tough on crime certainly carries a lot of cachet, especially in the state. So that probably had a lot to do with it.
Thank you. I'm gonna suggest we take as many more questions we can. Then at 8:30, maybe we'll come to a hard stop to be respectful of everyone's time. I'll leave us with a few words and then give everyone back the rest of their evening.
Do either of you know how many folks on death row bounce back and forth from with the status changes in the law over time?
Oh, interesting. Like how many are still on death row that would have been on when the repeal bill passed?
Yeah.
And then
yeah.
it would be most of them.
Most of them.
Yeah. Right, because anybody that was on has been on for, because that happened less than 10 years ago. So anybody
Right.
who's been on 10 years or less. So all but 3.
Okay.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Wow.
Yeah.
Have there been any studies or anything to show the psychological effects on the staff that serve on these execution teams involved in carrying out the death penalty?
I don't know if there have been studies, Alex, but I know there's been quite a few folks who used to work in corrections who have spoken about that experience afterwards and how difficult that was. So Ron McAndrews, I think, came to Nebraska a couple of times in some of the legislative discussions, and he worked in Florida carrying out executions, and he spoke a lot, you know, from his own experience, at least anecdotally, about how difficult that was and the impact it had on him and his coworkers. So I'm not sure if there's ever been any formal study of that, but I think, you know, there's certainly, you know, stories that folks have chosen to share about that experience that, you know, that they've had and how difficult that is, you know, to go on, you know, so in some of those states where they're executing folks very regularly, you know, that becomes a huge part of your job. And I think there's an extra, it feels like some of the story has been around how there's been an extra strain with lethal injection when medical folks won't participate in this thing that you are doing that is inherently somewhat medical, to have to be doing that and to know that it sometimes doesn't go right. That I think that makes it even worse, I would imagine, as an experience for those folks.
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, just real quick, I was able to weasel my way around a paywall momentarily. Back in 2015, there was a North Platte Telegraph op-ed written by a former corrections officer who worked on death row. She said, "I'm not alone in feeling this way. From entry-level corrections officers to wardens and chaplains, all stripes of prison personnel have expressed the difficulty or even trauma of being made to participate in executions. Earlier this year, a warden from Florida who oversaw executions told Esquire magazine how the experience still haunts him literally. He wakes up in the middle of the night and sees the faces of the men he had to execute." I assume that may have been Ron McAndrew.
I think that might have been Ronnie, yeah.
Yeah, she goes on to say, "He and I have both heard the muffled pleas of our colleagues who don't want anything to do with taking the life of another human being, but feel they have no choice. They need their jobs. I understand all too well why so many of my colleagues would call in sick on the day of an execution." So absolutely, there's some deep trauma being done, not just to the people being executed, those people's family members also, but indeed just the people involved in carrying it out. They have to carry that with them for the rest of their lives, and that's totally unnecessary.
And on the flip side, that's why we want two legislators to be present, right? So they have to carry it with them.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's what the state is saying that we want to do.
I had never thought about it being a mandatory part of your job if you work at a prison with the death row, that you're, it wasn't, maybe part of your hiring and this is part of your job. Being appointed to that team randomly or something would be really difficult.
I can't even imagine like taking a prison guard job to pay off student loans and all of a sudden, oh, here I am standing 5 feet away while we kill a guy. Like, how do you get over that? I don't know if I could.
Maybe walking them to the room. Yeah, wow. We kind of talked about this a little bit about when we were talking about the stats with, who gets the death penalty, but someone asked, in modern times, has a rich person been executed that we know of?
My guess would be no. If I had to guess, my guess would be certainly no.
Yeah.
I would be very surprised.
I think there would have been a comment on that chat, right? If someone knew of one.
Yeah, I mean, if nobody here on this call knows the answer to that, then I think the answer is no.
The answer is no, right? We did have just a couple of questions, and I think this about covers it. And how is this new method, nitrogen hypoxia, not cruel and unusual punishment? How are we not getting there? And I listened to the testimony. I saw Alex and Maggie and Spike testify online. Our vets are coming out and saying, hey, we won't even put your old dog down with this. Like, how are we where's the justification, or where? And I know that we talked about the not being able to find the drugs for lethal injection, but how's it not cruel and unusual punishment?
I mean, so the problem is, right, that you're going to have to go through a process to get into a place where a court can rule on that, right? So the court isn't going to come to the Nebraska legislature and say, hey, by the way, did you know this thing you're trying to do is eventually going to be found unconstitutional, right? So they're going to try, and they're going to hope that it works. And then, eventually there may be a case that finds its way up through the process, and all of that takes a long time. So I don't think there's any, I don't think that, I don't think anybody here would say that it is constitutional. I think the problem is that it will have to go through a long and drawn out process, likely led by other states who are further in the process already, like Alabama, right? Before it can even be heard in front of first a state court, and then make its way through the federal courts. So
yeah, granted, I absolutely don't believe any of what he said, but the senator who introduced the bill during his opening talked about an experience he had while he was in pilot training in the Air Force, I believe, and
yeah,
they simulated this nitrogen hypoxia as in like, here's what it feels like when, say, you lose cabin pressure at like 8 miles above sea level and you're not getting enough oxygen, just so you know what to look out for. And he described the experience. They used medical grade nitrogen to simulate this effect on him, by the way. And his description of that experience was that he felt warm and comfortable and sleepy and just all of this stuff. And I would have liked to point out that this is because he knew that nobody would let him die from this.
Right.
Like, if something is happening to you and you have complete and total trust in those around you to prevent anything actually bad from happening to you, of course it won't be that bad an experience. Of course you get a little sleepy because your adrenaline system doesn't necessarily kick in the same way. Whereas if you start experiencing oxygen deprivation, nitrogen suffocation, let's not use the H word here. When you're surrounded by people whose job it is to kill you, well, of course you're going to have a very different experience. And I don't think anyone really had the wherewithal to think to challenge him on that. I regret not bringing it up during my testimony because I didn't really think about it until later. I'm like, hold on a minute, no one was going to let you die from this. So I don't know. It's probably not cruel and unusual for him, since it was just like a brief dip before they let him back out.
So true. Well, thank you again, Alex and Jill. If you guys know how to use, if everyone in the audience knows how to use your reaction, to give them a round of applause. They deserve it because they've been such troopers in answering all of my questions. And I know we see some people dropping off, but I'm very pleased at the attendance that we had this evening. I wanted to just share a couple things. A couple thoughts. I'm going to get on my own soapbox here. As you know, Nebraskans for Peace, a representative from them. I would make the argument that even though, and Alex, I understand what Alex's point was, that there are so few people that we are trying to go through all this trouble of keeping the death penalty, and for what reason? For how, like, this, this many people in this period of time, and how it's a horrible waste of resources and all of that, and it's not. Getting rid of it is not going to impact that many people. But at the same time, there was someone who accidentally came off of mute and said, kind of my thoughts is that having the death penalty does something to us, and that affects everyone in our state or in our country for those states that have it. I also just wanted to share some of the footnotes from my time at UNO. There was a class I took, I don't know if it's still there, but it's just about the death penalty and capital punishment. The books we read by this Austin Serrett was When the State Kills. So I highly recommend that one. And I can put that in the chat. I would also suggest that if you watch the movie Monster with Charlize Theron, it kind of gives you a perspective into what it takes for a woman to be sentenced to execution. I think you'll find that it has to do with whether or not she fits the social construct for what a woman should be, do, look like, act, all of those things. So that's a really interesting perspective. Again, I just want to thank everybody for giving some time to be here this evening, especially to our panelists, of course. And thank you for everyone for being here. And I truly hope that, I don't want it to be too long before we all see each other again, but it would be great if the next time we do see each other, if we were talking about being able to abolish or having abolished the death penalty once again here in Nebraska, hopefully for good.
Yes, let's put Alex out of a job. No.
Yes, please.
Maggie,
Or
Maggie,
send
I
him
have a
to
question.
another.
We'll bring him somewhere else.
Yeah,
Maggie,
absolutely.
so what is the investment of NFP in abolishing the death penalty? The
Sorry, what is the
original
investment? What?
of NFP in abolishing the death penalty.
Where's the investment?
Mhm.
Sorry, tell me what you mean by that. And Brittany, I said, I don't
How
know if
much
you want to keep
money
recording
are you spending on abolishing the death penalty?
Oh, we do not spend much money on anything. We have a pretty tight budget just to keep